Well, then what about slavery? It would have been so easy had God or Jesus or anyone else in the Bible wanted to make it clear that slavery was an abomination. They simply could have said that, right? I mean,
Because slavery is not an abomination. The kind of slavery we've decided to take that word and associate it with an abomination. That's what's occurred. And this is where Sam's getting all wrapped up. And this is the reason why you have to disentangle these things. We still practice a lot of elements that would have been called slavery in ancient times, and we don't call those an abomination. So we have to. The only way to get into this topic is to disentangle this word from our recent past, the abomination that did happen in our recent past.
According to the Bible, a man could be a responsible Christian and a slave owner and not be in sin simply because he was in that relationship.
mm,
He would have to do all the things the Bible said to do. And I think he would agree that manumission was the long-term desired goal because the Spirit of the Lord brings liberty with him. The gospel sets people free, sets men and women free. And I think that has civic ramifications and has
mm.
implications for the slave trade.
So this is how I would encourage Christians to address this topic, because I think we need to. Our goal is to try to explain how can this be more moral, and I think it all needs to start with this question. If an atheist asks this question, you need to ask them: should it be illegal for me to sell myself into slavery? If I am starving to death, or if I believe my family will starve to death in a subsistence economy that existed in many ancient times, should it be illegal in order to protect my family or preserve our lives? Should it be illegal for me to sell myself into slavery? Because a lot of what was occurring back then, so much of slavery was debt based. There's another word that is often translated for the word slave in the New Testament, which is bond servant. The reason that is used is it's a very different kind of relationship that many slaves in ancient times, particularly within sort of a Toraic context where you see slavery being discussed, part of what you want to preserve in these cultures is the ability for people to sell themselves into slavery, right? The left is constantly saying, my body, my choice. I should be able to sell myself, sexually or whatever. Like they are constantly proclaiming that kind of liberation should be offered to people, while at the same time condemning the Bible's not forbidding a father from selling himself into slavery in order to save his family. I think that's why biblical slavery was still something that needed to exist as being possible and not expressly forbidden. It should always be discouraged. And anytime somebody finds themselves in that situation, they should be well treated and there should be laws that are protecting them. But you had in these economies these situations that were repeatedly happening that were very, very common, where people would be at risk of starvation. And one of the things that you were allowed to do was go into debt in order to save yourself. But what do you do when you didn't have any assets to go into debt in order to protect or preserve your family? The final asset you had was your own body, your labor, your future labor. And so you would sell that future labor in order to save your family. And I don't think it creates a more moral society to say, no, we should let those people starve to death. Now you might say, well, we should feed them. But that's very easy for us to say now that we're on the other side of an industrial sort of food production where there's tons and tons of excess food, and that getting food to people that are starving is really more of a matter of just transporting it properly, making sure that it gets to them and doesn't get doesn't fall into the hands of people who are using starvation as a political tool to oppress people. That's kind of the situation we find ourselves in today. That was not what was occurring in ancient times. People were oftentimes in terrible situations where they were struggling with famines and other reasons for their wars and other causes of the levels of food insecurity that caused them to want to go into debt in order to not die this horrible, horrible way, or watch their children die of starvation. And so I think that the Bible preserves that option. And then they would extend that option for other reasons. And you can like debate whether or not that's wise. So is it wise for someone to go into debt through slavery in order to buy a field so that someday in the future they might be able to provide for their family in better ways. Was it a bad idea during the 17th century? People oftentimes would sell themselves into indentured servitude for 7 years to gain the passage from the old world to the new world. They would be forced to work as indentured servants for 7 years, often, in order to pay off whatever costs were associated with them coming to the new world. And then they were like, this is a better deal for me and my family. Like we could live in the old world and be in grinding poverty, or we can sell ourselves as indentured servants, get across the Atlantic, work for 7 years, and then be free to buy land. So these are examples that are totally illegal today because they all fall under the rubric of slavery. But we still today, we practice all kinds of slavery, things that would be considered slavery in ancient times. We just don't call it that. You know, there's all kinds of examples. The examples like when somebody goes into to college and takes out enormous amounts of loans that puts them for decades into servitude to a lender who is insisting, and they cannot discharge that debt in any way, even in bankruptcy. There is no necessarily rest for them. I mean, one of the things that in ancient times, when you would enslave someone because they were in debt to you, you were still forced to help them pay that back by giving them something to do in order to repay that debt so they can get out of slavery. Today, we don't do that at all. Like we have people going to college, getting into hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and then they may not find a job. And they simply will watch those interest payments pile up over time and just crush them, right? That's an example of modern slavery. We wouldn't call it that because we don't associate debt with slavery. We associate racism with slavery. That is a much more recent frame. And racist-based, kidnap-based slavery, the kind of slavery that happened in the transatlantic slave trade, again, would have always been illegal according to Toraic law. There are so many laws, so many specific rules and laws that were violated in every step of that process. We also do things like when there's a POW, we forced German soldiers to work, and they were very, very happy compared to their counterparts in for example, Russian POWs of the Germans. They were enslaved in one way, but we also required many of our German prisoners of war to work in farms when they were, and that was considered slavery. We didn't call it that. We don't call it that today. Anytime somebody's in prison, and their entire prison system was based on slavery in ancient times. Today we still have a fair amount of that going on within prison systems, and so these things because we've associated slavery with one activity that is related to the kind of race-based slavery that started with kidnapping and then ended with chattel slavery, where the slaves had no rights at all, and in a really industrial level economy where this could be done at massive scale, that just does not care about life in that sense, then we say, well, look, aren't we so moral? We outlawed that. And we're not that moral. That would have been outlawed in many, many societies, including any society based on the Bible. But they would allow bond servants, they would allow indentured servitude, they would allow somebody to sell themselves into slavery to an advantage that they believed they could get in order to provide a better future for their family. These were things that were allowed. They're not necessary any longer. There's better tools for that. And again, we have a lot of those same levels of slavery happening in our society today, but we just don't call it that. So that's kind of, I think, a better framing for how to think about the topic. But I do appreciate a lot of the things that Doug says here about Philemon.